You have probably read Frankenstein, or seen one of the movies, or at least know the story. A scientist, a monster, a warning about what happens when humans try to play God. You know where Mary Shelley got the idea. A nightmare, the story goes, a dark and stormy night at a villa in Switzerland. A ghost story competition between friends. Mary, barely 18 years old, dreamed something terrible and woke up and wrote it down. That part is true. What nobody tells you is why the night was so dark, why the storm was so violent, why a teenage girl in Switzerland in the summer of 1816 was trapped indoors for weeks at a time with nothing to do but think about death and monsters and what it would mean to bring a dead thing back to life. The answer is sitting in a crater on the other side of the planet. And it killed 200,000 people before anyone understood what had happened. On April 5th, 1815, the residents of the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, heard what they assumed was cannon fire. Several nearby ships changed course to investigate. They found nothing. The sound was coming from a volcano called Mount Tambora. And over the next 5 days, Tambora did something that no mountain in recorded human history had ever done. It erupted, not in the way most volcanoes erupt. A lava flow, a plume of ash, a localized disaster. Tambora exploded with a force that modern scientists estimate released energy equivalent to 14,000 nuclear bombs detonated simultaneously. The eruption was heard 1,600 miles away. The pyroclastic flows from the collapse reached the sea and generated tsunamis that killed thousands within hours. The ashfall alone was so thick and so heavy that it buried entire villages. The island of Sumbawa lost an estimated 71,000 people in the eruption itself. That was just the beginning. Because the thing about Tambora, the thing that changed the entire world, wasn't the lava or the ash or the tsunamis. It was what went into the sky. When Tambora erupted, it injected an estimated 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The stratosphere sits 10 to 15 miles above the Earth's surface, above the weather systems, above the clouds, in the layer of atmosphere where molecules can stay suspended for years. Those sulfur dioxide particles mixed with water vapor and formed aerosols, microscopic reflective droplets that spread around the globe over the following months, wrapping the entire planet in an invisible veil. The veil reflected sunlight, and the Earth got colder, not by a dramatic amount. Average global temperatures in 1816 dropped by approximately 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius compared to normal years. Less than 1 degree. That's all it took to break civilization. In New England, farmers planted their fields in the spring of 1816 as they always had. They watched the crops come up. They began to plan for harvest. In June, it snowed, not a dusting. Significant snowfall in Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire in the middle of June. Frost in July. Killing frost again in August. The growing season simply did not arrive. Farmers watched their corn wither and die in the ground. In some parts of New England, every crop failed completely. In Quebec, a foot of snow fell in June. The region had never seen anything like it. People called it 1800 and froze to death. They had no idea why it was happening. They had no knowledge of Mount Tambora. They had no concept of stratospheric aerosols. As far as they knew, the world had simply stopped working. The price of oats in New England tripled, then quadrupled, then became effectively unavailable at any price. And this is where the story goes somewhere unexpected. Because in Germany, a man named Karl Drees was facing the same problem. Horses across Europe were dying, not from cold directly, but from the collapse of the oat supply. Without oats, horses starved. And without horses, European civilization, which ran entirely on horse transport, began to seize up. Drees needed a way to move without a horse, so he invented one. In 1817, Karl Drees built the first prototype of the velocipede, a two-wheeled human power vehicle that you steer with handlebars and propelled by pushing your feet against the ground. It was crude, uncomfortable, and widely mocked. It was also the direct ancestor of every bicycle ever built, one of the most transformative inventions in human history. The technology that would give ordinary people personal mobility for the first time was born because a volcano in Indonesia killed all the horses. In Europe, the crop failures triggered something older and more dangerous than inconvenience: famine. In Ireland, the potato harvest failed. In France, grain prices rose so sharply that bread became unaffordable for large portions of the working population. In Wales, Switzerland, and across Germany, food riots broke out. Crowds attacked granaries and merchants. Governments deployed troops. The social order, already fragile from decades of Napoleonic War, began to fracture. In Switzerland, the canton of Bern declared a state of emergency. Tens of thousands of people who had survived the wars were now facing starvation in peacetime for reasons nobody could explain. In Asia, the disruption was even more catastrophic. The sulfur veil that wrapped the planet also disrupted the Indian monsoon, the seasonal rainfall that hundreds of millions of people in South Asia depended on to grow food. The monsoon failed or arrived weakly for multiple consecutive years. Rice harvests collapsed across Bengal. The disruption to weather patterns extended into China, where Yunnan province experienced crop failures so severe that farmers abandoned farming entirely and turned to growing opium as the only crop that could survive the changed conditions. And then something moved out of India that would kill more people than the famine itself. In 1817, a new strain of cholera emerged in Bengal. It spread along trade routes, the same routes now flooded with desperate, displaced, hungry people moving in search of food. It reached Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East. It reached Europe. The first global cholera pandemic killed tens of millions of people over the following 2 decades. The chain of causation runs in a straight line. Tambora, sulfur veil, failed harvest, famine, displacement, cholera, 1 eruption, 1 invisible veil, 1 degree of cooling, millions of deaths. Back in Switzerland, at the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva, Lord Byron and his companions were trapped indoors by rain and cold and darkness that should not have existed in the middle of summer. Byron wrote a poem in that darkness. He called it simply Darkness. It began, "I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished." He had no idea how close to literal truth he was. Mary Shelley, also trapped at the villa, was having nightmares. In the long, dark, cold evenings that should have been summer, surrounded by people talking about death and galvanism and whether electricity could reanimate dead tissue, she dreamed of a scientist standing over a creature assembled from corpses. She woke up and started writing. Frankenstein was published in 1818, the monster that has haunted Western culture for 2 centuries, the symbol of scientific ambition, of the danger of creation without responsibility, of life assembled from death, was conceived in the darkness of summer that never came, in the shadow of a volcano 8,000 miles away that its creator never knew existed. The world did not understand what had happened until 1920, more than a century after the eruption, when scientists finally began connecting the historical climate records to Tambora's eruption. The full connection between Tambora, the year without a summer, the cholera pandemic, Frankenstein, and the bicycle was not assembled until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as climate historians began reconstructing the global ripple effects of the eruption in detail. Most people alive today have never heard of Mount Tambora. They know Frankenstein. They ride bicycles. They live in countries shaped by the migration patterns of 1816, when hundreds of thousands of New Englanders abandoned their failed farms and moved west, populating the American interior in numbers that permanently shifted the demographic and political balance of the United States. The states of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio filled with people who left because a volcano they never heard of killed their crops. The Democratic Party's westward political base, the pattern of American political geography that persisted for a century, traces a direct line back to the eruption of a mountain that most Americans cannot locate on a map. Here is what the science tells us. In the 130 years since humans began keeping systematic global temperature records, there have been at least 4 volcanic eruptions large enough to cause measurable global cooling. Tambora in 1815 was the largest, Krakatoa in 1883, Pinatubo in 1991. Each one dropped global temperatures, disrupted harvests, altered weather patterns, and sent consequences radiating outward in directions nobody anticipated. Pinatubo dropped global temperatures by 0.5 degrees Celsius for 2 years. Scientists credit it with slowing global warming by roughly a decade. One volcano, half a degree. A decade of consequences. Tambora was 20 times more powerful than Pinatubo, and it changed everything. The monster in the novel, the bicycle in the street, the city your ancestors moved to, the pandemic that killed your great-great-grandparents' neighbors, the political party that shaped your country's laws. All of it, tracing back through a chain of consequences nobody saw, to a single April night in 1815, when a mountain on an island most people cannot name decided that the sky had held enough and let go